Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you all for coming. I'm from the South in the United States. I was born and grew up in New Orleans. But if you know anything about accents from watching TV, we don't sound like anywhere else in the South because actually New Orleans is a heavily Irish-Italian port city, and we sound like we're from somewhere between New Jersey and Boston. You may not get all the nuances of that, but it's just, I have to explain that in the States, otherwise people are sitting there the whole time trying to figure out, well, he doesn't sound like he's from New Orleans. I was on the board of Catholic Social Services in Atlanta during the years I worked for legal aid there, and then the director of the agency in Baton Rouge, and then worked nationally for Catholic Charities USA, and so picked up a lot of history and of the conflicts and tensions that are involved with Catholic Social Services, as you call it in most places here, or Catholic Charities as they're more likely to be called in the United States. But I want to tell two stories about this before I get into it, because I was asked by Anthony and Dr. Renee to talk about what makes Catholic Charities different from others, and I had done this article some years ago about 10 ways Catholic Charities are Catholic, and so I've given you that, but this text will kind of take us from there. But I was doing some training for our own staff at Catholic Community Services in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and there was a Baptist lady who worked for our senior employment programs, and she was great. But she came up to me after, she says, Father Kammer, she said, I just love Catholic Community Services. She said, I just wish my church had a Catholic Community Services. I thought, well, that would be an interesting thing in her Baptist church. But later, when I was the national president, we brought together a task force to talk about Catholic identity within Catholic Charities agencies. And one of the directors of really one of the largest programs in the country in Chicago, who was later a bishop there, now deceased, but he said to the task force at their first meeting, so we have three sets of staff members. He said, we have those people who are active Catholics in their parishes, they teach CCD, et cetera, for whom working at Catholic Charities is like icing on the cake. He said, we have a second group of people who were raised Catholic and who've been alienated from the church for one reason or another about this or that or whatever, and who hold on to working at Catholic Charities as the last piece of their Catholic identity. I call them, he didn't call them that, retired Roman Catholics. And he said, we have a third group of people who work with us from other faith communities who deeply share our values, to which another very senior director said, and we have a fourth group of people for whom this is a job. And it's in that context and that reality, because that's the reality, as I've been here since March the 10th in Melbourne at Newman College, and I'm sort of a guest of the Jesuits there. My sense is that there's a lot of that involved with Catholic social service agencies here in Australia as well. But I introduced those stories just to get at kind of the variety of people who are involved in our agencies in Australia and in the United States, and the complex and challenging endeavor it is to lead an agency and maintain its Catholic identity, and what that Catholic identity actually should mean. So I did this article years ago, and I want to sort of build off those 10 points, but talk about kind of why we do what we do, and how we do what we do, and how it's rooted in our Catholicism. And to do so, I'm going to touch into sort of the history of the mission of Catholic Charities and Catholic Social Services here in Australia, authoritative documents of the Church about our identity, and the experiences of our agencies. First, what we do is rooted in the Scriptures. If you go back to the Old Testament, etc., there was a group of people known in Hebrew as the Anawim, A-N-A-W-I-M. When I first encountered the word 40 years ago, it means the little ones. Later, digging down into it, it means those who cry out to God for help. And there were three groups of people. They were widows, and orphans, and strangers. We sometimes translate the text as strangers or sojourners, but they were foreigners who lived in Israel. And I told staffs as I went around the country doing retreat days for staffs in the United States, please, there are a lot of seats up front. I used to tell staff, it's still those same three groups of people that you serve today. In general, the agencies are serving poor women, poor children, and people who are strangers. They're not like us, who are literally the immigrants and refugees in our society or your society, or they have HIV/AIDS, or they have or they have a disability, or they have some other reason that people consider them to be, quote, not like us. And it's still those people that are served not just in Australia or in the USA, but by the member agencies of, we all belong to an international group called Caritas Internationalis, which is Charity International, which is based in Rome. And if you look at the agencies across the world, we're still serving those three groups of people because those are, in general, the poor and the powerless in every country. And for the people of Israel, the test of their faith was how they cared for these people and how they protected them from oppression. And you read that a lot in the prophets. And those two things, that distinction of service and protection, are distinctions that carry through these 10 qualities of what makes Catholic Charities Catholic. In the New Testament, and I'll just go to one example, Pope Benedict wrote a letter, and I'm going to quote it a number of times, called God is Love, Deus Caritas Est. And it was his first encyclical letter. An encyclical, by the way, because people, you see the word for years and years, you wonder, what's an encyclical? Encyclical originally was a letter from the Bishop of Rome to the bishops of the world. Later, under John the 23rd, the Pope in the middle of the 20th century, John wrote to my brother bishops, my fellow priests and religious, lay Catholics, and other people of goodwill. And that set a tone, really, for this writing about the Church's social mission that's been carried on by popes ever since then, with one or two small examples. In fact, this letter by Benedict was only addressed to the Catholic community because it was about organized charity within the Church. But in that letter, Benedict says there were three great parables of Jesus. Now, I'd never heard anyone signal out what were the three great parables of Jesus, but Benedict does. Pope Benedict says the three great parables of Jesus are the rich man and Lazarus lying at his door. You remember the story. The rich man is eating sumptuously. Lazarus is lying at the door having nothing to eat. Rich man goes to hell. Lazarus goes to heaven. And later, the rich man appeals to Lazarus or to Abraham and Lazarus to let him, to bring some water to him in hell. And Peter says, you had your chance. I mean, Abraham says, you had your chance, etc. So that's the first great parable. The second one is the Good Samaritan, which Benedict develops at length in this letter, Deus Caritas Est. And the third one is the judgment scene in the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. You remember, Jesus is describing the ends of the world. He says the Son of Man will come and he will judge the nations, and which is an interesting thing. Commentators will say this is about nations. And he will separate them as sheep from goats, and will say to those on his right, come, beloved of my Father, come into the kingdom prepared for you from the beginning of time, because I was hungry, and you fed me, and I was naked, and you clothed me, I was sick, I was in prison, and you visited me. And they say, when did we see you, Lord? He said, whenever you did it for the least of my sisters and brothers, you did it for me. And then he says to those on his left, and I always say to people, I'm sorry you sat over here, but he says, go to hell. It's actually much stronger if you pick up the text. It's be condemned forever into everlasting fire and damnation, because I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was naked, you didn't clothe me. I was sick, I was in prison, you didn't visit me. And they say, when did we see you, Lord? And he says, whenever you didn't do it to the least of my sisters and brothers, you didn't do it to me. The scholars actually say that the deeper insight in the text, because every time I traveled in the States talking to groups, they'd use that text for the opening prayer. And I would tell the staff, I'd say, we think it's about justice, which was the word to describe the relationships, etc. But in fact, what it's about is the repeated line that both groups ask him, when did we see you, Lord? And whenever you did it or did not do it for the least of my sisters and brothers, you did or did not do it for me. And it's the identification of Jesus, as the popes have talked, and as Benedict talks about, with the poor themselves. And so it builds on the Old Testament and the New Testament, what we do in Catholic Charities. And that's my second point, that this ministry has been an integral part of the Catholic Church for 2,000 years. It begins, if you want, in the Acts of the Apostles. If you remember the story in the Acts of the Apostles, the Hebrew community has some members who speak Greek, or the early Christian community. They're all Jews, but some speak Greek. And there's a complaint at the beginning, because they're sharing, the text in Acts says they're sharing their all goods in common, and they're feeding the widows and the orphans. Again, that's at least the Anoim. So the Anoim at the heart of that story. And the story is that the Greek widows and orphans are not receiving a share of the community's distribution of food. And so their representatives come to the apostles and say, we're not being treated fairly. It's basically a justice question, and it's, if you want, an early form of racism. And so they appoint the 7 deacons to make sure that the widows and orphans are taken care of within the early community. And so it's an early part of the ministry there, and the appointment of the deacons is about carrying on this care for others. Benedict points out that the ministry was institutionalized in the first centuries of the church and later in the development of the monasteries. That it was in the monasteries we think of as the places that maintain learning, which they did, but it was also in the monasteries where people brought their orphan children, where they brought their sick elderly, etc., to be cared for. So much so, he says, that in the 6th century, church structures for caring for the poor and the needy was so good that the government in Egypt entrusted the grain to be distributed to people in need to the church to distribute. And I say, because I'm going to come back to this as a later point, that's the beginning of sort of collaboration between the church and the state that takes place very widely in both Australia and the United States and all over the world. And then as you build, we're coming across about 1,500 years of history, but as the religious begin moving out of the monasteries and into the cities and towns, they found hospices and places to educate the poor and things like that, and they carry on those ministries. And so you have the saints that we know of, for example, very well identified with the ministry to the poor and the needy. St. Vincent de Paul in France in the 17th century. St. Francis of Assisi, the name Pope Francis took. St. Clare, St. Peter Claver, St. Catherine of Siena, St. Martin de Porres, St. Ignatius of Loyola. And in Australia, Mary Mother MacKillop carried on the same ministry here in Australia as well. And so the religious did that. And then those ministries from a more traditional European church were carried into the New World. They were carried into the New World of the Americas, and then carried into the New World here in Australia as well. So that here in my hometown, in 1727, the Ursuline sisters came to New Orleans, and they began really the first healthcare ministry. It was basically a place for people wounded in the Indian Wars, schooling, which was for the children of slaves and Native Americans, and social services. And these are the three, I call them the three great external ministries of the church outside the parish, are healthcare, education, as in the case of this university, and social services, as in the case of Catholic Social Services. And so they began those ministries. And what's interesting, it took them 6 months. You all would know this from reading Australian history. It took them 6 months to get from France to New Orleans. And they came there. Their mission was to do whatever was needed. To do whatever was needed. And that's the way they began their ministries there. They still run an Ursuline Academy, a girls' school in New Orleans, to this day. And that tradition carries on here in Australia. So, for example, Catholic Social Services in Australia reports that Catholic Charities, Catholic Service agencies now assist 850,000 people a year in 650 sites with 15,000 staff and 7,500 volunteers. And they provide, for example, the following: end-of-life care, group homes for persons with mental disabilities, support for indigenous community and development, resettlement of refugees and immigrants, foster and respite care, the counseling of troubled families, hospice care to people with HIV/AIDS, the feeding of hungry families, providing bushfire and flood recovery, and sheltering people who are homeless. And that's just a sample. And as you look across your country, or as you look across my country, there's an incredible variety, generally created by the needs of the community and shaped by those needs. As a result of this history, when Benedict does this history in his letter on God is Love, he ends up saying that the three essentials of the Catholic Church are the Word, the Scriptures, the sacraments, which we're all familiar with, and organized charity. And that without those three essentials, you do not have a really Catholic institution or church. So that's a little bit of kind of snapshot history. Third point. Catholic Charities agencies, Catholic Social Services agencies promote the sanctity of human life and the dignity of the human person. That's the ultimate rationale for the services we provide. And it applies to every human being, and it's a quality that we never lose. So no matter what condition we're in when we're born, and no matter what we do in our lives, even criminal activity, etc., we never lose this identity that is sacred. And so all the services of the agencies are focused on people's needs and on respecting that identity and that sacredness of every person. So while some people might be excluded because they're sick or disabled or poor or racially different, Catholic Charities agencies, Catholic Social Service agencies reach out to them with respect for their human dignity. And I used to say to the staffs, often when somebody comes to you, they're people who have not been treated well, often in their whole lives. And that your offering even of hospitality and respect for them may be the first time that they've experienced this in their lives. And while society may reject some people because they're in prison or they're indigenous or they're undocumented, our agencies will work to enhance their dignity, improve their lives, and to try to meet their needs. Remember that Jesus himself actually responds to the needs of people who are not Jews. He cures, for example, the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman. He cures the servant of the Roman officer. He cures the woman by the well. He cures people who are not approved, appropriate people in the minds of majorities. And because of this, we have certain values and standards because of this quality of the human person in terms of their dignity and sanctity that are represented generally. In the United States, we have, at the national level, we adopted years ago, 30, 40 years ago, a code of ethics. We urged every local agency to take that code of ethics and adapt it and then adopt it for themselves. And the code of ethics begins with that, some of the things like the sanctity and dignity of the human person, the preferential concern that the church has for the poor, and so on and so forth. And those are some of our priority values. And so the preferences for the people who are the neediest and the poorest are represented in most agencies by where they put their offices, how they shape their services, even things like using a sliding scale if they need to charge to be able to help support the ministry so that it slides, the cost of services go from zero to whatever might be appropriate under the circumstances. And they engage in advocacy, and I'll come back to that later. Fourth, Catholic Charities agencies are authorized to exercise their ministry by the diocesan bishop. This applies to whether the agency is founded by a religious congregation, Sisters of Mercy, or what it may be, or whether it's founded by lay people, or whether it's a Vincent de Paul conference, as you call them here in Australia. It's a great phrase, the Vinnies. Doesn't matter what the groups are in general, anyone who exercises ministry within a diocese is doing it under the overall authority of the bishop. And most people don't know, when the bishops take their vows, their promises, when they're ordained a bishop, they take a promise to care for the poor in their diocese. It's a specific part of their own set of vows and promises. And so however the agencies are organized under canon law and under civil law, et cetera, there's still this authority underneath the diocesan bishop. And again, there's great organizational variety in how the agencies are set up and even in the shape of their services created in response to local needs and their own capacities as well. The fifth is that, and this is a strange one, at least for some people in my country, that Catholic social service agencies, Catholic Community Services, as my agency was called in Baton Rouge, serve people of all faiths and none. In fact, we certainly did not keep statistics on the faith community from which people came. And in my experience, I don't know of any other agency who did that. Because we would find it strange to be asking people about their religious affiliation. And it's part of our determination as church to serve the needs of the whole community. And as I said earlier, we see this in Jesus' own ministry as well. And this fits in with Vatican II's focus on ecumenism and on interfaith respect for others as well. And again, respects human dignity, religious liberty in my country, and the ecumenical sensitivity of Vatican II. So many people come to us for a particular need. They come for a hot meal, or a safe place to stay, or a voucher for prescription medicine, or resettlement in a new nation, or the resources to rebuild after a personal or a natural disaster. They don't need religious proselytizing. I'll come back to that and nuance in a moment. So it would be strange for us to preach Catholic beliefs, for example, to a devout Muslim family who are resettling from Bosnia, or to a Lutheran elder to whom we deliver a home-delivered hot meal in the middle of the day, or to my Baptist lady who worked for us, et cetera, and expect that they're going to be Catholic. But we are Catholic because that's what we do, not because they're Catholic. In fact, John Paul II, Saint Pope John Paul II, spoke to our national gathering in 1986 in San Antonio at a meeting that I was attending, and he said this is the Pope: "For your long and persevering service, creative and courageous, and blind to the distinctions of race or religion, you will hear Jesus' words of gratitude, 'You did it for me.'" That's the Pope saying. Blind to the distinctions of race or religion, you will hear Jesus' words of gratitude, "You did it to me." 10 years later, John Paul was speaking to, it just got reorganized a few years back, a pontifical council called Cor Unum, One Heart. And it was in charge of oversight of the church's charitable ministry. And he spoke to them 10 years ago and said that charitable activity was an eloquent means of Catholic evangelization, even though we may not be proselytizing, because it witnesses to a spirit of giving and of communion inspired by God who created all men and women. But he continued, the primary motivation for Catholic giving is to serve Christ in the poor and suffering and to promote peace, justice, and development worthy of the children of God. And in his words, let me quote him directly, actions of aid, relief, and assistance should be conducted in a spirit of service and free giving for the benefit of all persons without the ulterior motive of eventual tutelage or proselytism. So we don't do this to make people Catholics. Pope Benedict, writing about the same question, again in Deus Caritas Est, wrote, charity, furthermore, cannot be used as a means of engaging in what is nowadays called proselytism. Love is free. It is not practiced as a way of achieving other ends. And so the love of God is to be shown in how the agencies work and what they do in terms of outreaching and caring for people. Now, to qualify that, there are some services that Catholic agencies will provide that are particularly tailored to the Catholic community and that serve Catholic parishes and Catholics in particular. For example, maybe marriage preparation and marriage counseling, or parish outreach and training, where we go into a parish, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, and train their volunteers and their members in how to better reach out to the needs in their own local community. Or hospital chaplaincies, as Catholic Social Services does here in this country as well. Or Catholic school counseling, putting counselors into the Catholic schools themselves. And so these services are primarily aimed at a Catholic population and have more explicit Catholic content and often are funded by the Catholic diocese. Sixth, that when we serve people, we recognize that the service we provide requires attention to their physical, mental, now this will sound like I'm gainsaying what I just said, and spiritual needs. That sometimes the person coming in has, in fact, spiritual needs and needs to attend to that spiritual part of themselves. For example, addiction treatment program. We all heard of 12-step programs, appeal to a higher power, et cetera, has to, in the treatment of alcohol and drug abuse, deal with the spiritual in their lives. Homeless shelters will often provide opportunities for people to pray together in the evening, et cetera, of whatever denomination they're from. Elderly, sometimes in the United States, we operate a lot of you call it aged care, but a lot of nursing homes and care for the elderly, and often people there receive chaplaincy services, and Catholic Charities may provide it or may be arranging for a chaplain to come, even of another faith community as well. And then marriage and family counseling often requires people dealing with their spirituality as well as the rest of their relationship to one another. Pope Benedict, again, writing in God is Love, he underscored the openness to the spiritual that needs to be in all services, all charitable services, when he emphasizes the concern of charity for the whole person. He uses an interesting phrase. He said, people crave what he called the look of love because of their interior desire for love and concern. And Pope St. John Paul II made the same point in his talk in 1986. He said, no institution can by itself replace the human heart, or human compassion, human love, or human initiative when it is a question of dealing with the sufferings of others. Because the deepest cause of their suffering, John Paul said, may be the very absence of God. And so the church's charitable activity then doesn't impose religion, but it needs to remain open to communicate God's love and deeds. There was a sister in an agency in South Carolina who did refugee resettlement. So she worked with people of multiple faiths from around the world, but at the end of her meetings with them, after she dealt with whatever their resettlement problem was, she would say to them, would you like to pray? And people would pray with her of whatever background they came from, because she just felt that they needed to attend to the spiritual characteristics of people as they were doing it. Benedict, in writing about this, says, those who practice charity in the church's name will never seek to impose the church's faith upon others. They realize that a pure and generous love is the best witness to God in whom they believe, in whom we believe, and by whom we are driven to love. A Christian knows that when it is time to speak of God, and when it is better to say nothing and let love alone speak. He or she knows that God is love. The Franciscans, they say they can't prove this, so the Franciscans are reputed, St. Francis is reputed to have said to his followers, this is what we can't prove, preach the gospel, if necessary, use words. But they can't document. They all say Francis said this, but they actually can't prove that he did. Seventh, Catholic Social Services, Catholic Charities have a special relationship to the Catholic diocese and to Catholic parishes. At least in my country, in over half of the agencies, there's a program called Parish Social Ministry. And it's designed basically because the agencies are themselves very limited in terms of funding and time and staff. And so they help to animate the parish. And as I said earlier, Pope Benedict was saying organized charity needs to be a characteristic of every Catholic institution. And so one of the tasks we felt as agencies was helping the parishes to carry out their responsibility and to help Catholics carry out their baptismal commitment to people. And so in some agencies in the States, there's a parish social ministry committee. In others, they're the Vinnies. I mean, we don't call them that. We call them the St. Vincent de Paul Society. And in this capacity, we assist the parishioners in exercising, as I said, their baptismal commitment to the poor and needy. But we may also be providing professional training or support or encouragement to parish-based ministries. We, for example, in our office in Baton Rouge, would have brown bag lunches, as they were calling, where we invite people who had these jobs in the parishes. Usually it was like one person dealing with every poor person who came to the door of the rectory or the door of the parish. We'd bring them together once a month for mutual support of one another, but also to know what might be available from the government, a food program or whatever it may be like that. And that we felt was our way of multiplying our limited staff and supporting the work of the parishes around us. And so parish-based ministries often will be food pantries. The parish I lived in, Baton Rouge, had a food pantry where people came a couple of days a week between like 11 and 2 to get food, surplus food, etc. It may involve an outreach to the frail elderly, legislative networks for promoting justice, and action for global solidarity and peace. And by doing so, as I say, we help pastors to carry out their responsibilities for their parishes as well. I used to tell staff, when you go out to a parish, don't imply that you've got something else for Father to do, because Father has more than he can do right now. Go as if you're saying to the pastor, we can help you with what you have to do here. Because I had a friend who was a Jesuit who was a pastor of parish. He said, Fred, he said, on Mondays, I get a letter from the diocese about how I'm supposed to be an excellent youth minister. On Tuesday, I get a letter about how I should be counseling troubled families. On Wednesday, I get a letter from the liturgy department about how I'm supposed to be celebrating Mass on Thursday. And on Friday, I get a letter from Catholic Charities telling me this is what I'm supposed to do. He says, I could paper my office with the mail I get from the diocese every month. And so I would urge our staff to try to be of help to the pastors and not be giving them something more to do. And so parishes expand our capacity in things like community-wide soup kitchens, sponsorship of refugee families, that's a big role that Catholic families can play, and prison visitations. So our bishops in the United States wrote a letter in 1999 called In All Things Charity, and in that letter they urged parish leaders and parish members to develop links with diocesan social service agencies, so it was the other way around. And they encouraged the agencies to reach out to the parishes to support their social concern activities. There's another way that we collaborate with dioceses often, which is that dioceses, at least in the United States, have offices that are tailored to the church's social mission. They might have an office of, in our country, an office of African American Catholics, an office of Hispanic services, or an office of justice and peace that might be in the diocese, and Catholic Charities and Catholic Social Services can help those offices carry out their work. And then, of course, the St. Vincent de Paul Society may be organized at the level of the diocese, and so we work together with them. So that's the seventh thing, that we should collaborate with the church's official structures of both dioceses and parishes. The eighth way in which we're Catholic is that we work in active partnership with people of other faiths. We work in active partnership with the Lutherans, with the Baptists, here you have the United Church. There are active partnerships that we carry on with others, partly because none of us has enough resources for what we try to do, but also that if we build coalitions, we can have a greater impact upon social policy in the area we're in and upon the cities we're in, et cetera. And our bishops have encouraged that, and they wrote this: voluntary organizations, they said, play an important part in our collective efforts to promote the common good, to protect human life, to reach out to people in need, and to work for a more just and compassionate society. So they went on. Parishes, diocesan organizations, Catholic charity and justice organizations should take every reasonable opportunity to work with such associations, as well as those organizations sponsored by other faith communities. By the same token, we urge agencies to work with the unions, to work with corporations, to work with the business community, to work with other voluntary organizations in their communities to help provide volunteers, financial support, etc. Pope Benedict urged these charity workers to, quote, work in harmony with other organizations in serving various forms of need, but in a way that respects what is distinctive about the service that Christ requested of his disciples. I'll get to a case in a little bit where that was called into question. Another area of that collaboration is around advocacy for social justice. Just last month, Catholic Social Services of Australia jointly sponsored a joint letter with Anglicare Australia, the Salvation Army, and Uniting Care, calling upon, quote, all parties and candidates to commit to policies that will make a real difference in the lives of the most vulnerable, close quote. This is in anticipation of this month's election here. And that kind of ecumenical activity goes on all over my country. It's a very common kind of thing. Ninth, Catholic Charities support an active public-private partnership with government at all levels. This is the one that surprises a lot of people. I've been asked by people here who are involved in Catholic social service who know that there is, for example, 50, 60, 70% government money at some level involved in Catholic social service here in Australia. And I said the same thing in the United States. I said, we partner with government. I'll come back and talk about why in a moment. But we do it. The Catholic framework for this is that we believe government has the ultimate responsibility for what we call the common good, which is a term that comes actually from the Greek city-states. It was the duty of citizens to promote the common good of their communities and of elected figures in the Greek city-states to promote the common good. And the common good as defined in the Catholic Catechism, because we often as church gathered the best wisdom from the cultures we were in, and the common good is defined as protecting the individual rights of citizens, working to help balance out the interest of groups within the city, and peace, which is based in security. And so if you think about a place like Ukraine, there's no possibility of that because there's war going on right now. And so those three are the essentials of working of the common good within the Catholic Catechism. And so we believe that government has a responsibility for helping the poor. And so as Benedict taught, he says, the just ordering of society and the state is a central responsibility of politics. And in carrying out this responsibility, quote, justice is both the aim and the intrinsic criterion of all politics. And so the church's role here, we think, from the charity point, is to help form the consciences and education of the Catholic community and of the broader community about the authentic requirements of justice in society. So Benedict wrote, building a just social and civil order wherein each person receives what is his or her due is an essential task which every generation must take up anew. Now, we don't replace the state. That's the state's responsibility, but we have a duty to promote justice in the public dialogue, but we also have a twofold collaborative relationship to the civil society. There was a big debate in the 90s in Washington when I was working there, where some people were arguing, well, let's cut the government funding and let the churches and charities pick up the slack. I produced this graph that said, this is how much you're going to cut this year. This is how much is raised across our entire country by what we call United Way, which was a way of raising money for all the nonprofits in local communities. I said, and this is how much money we raised in Catholic Charities agencies across the country. There is no way we can replace that. And so the first area, when you think about relationship between the charities, not just our own, but others, and the state, is about basic income for people who can't support themselves, like Social Security. The state is the only one who has the money for that. What does happen, though, and I've seen this in parishes that I've lived in and worked in, I've seen this in my office in Baton Rouge, is on the 25th day of the month in the United States, all those checks run out. And the last 5 days of the month, people don't have enough to eat. And so they come to their local parish or their local synagogue or their local mosque asking for food. And that's very, very common. Or they ask, as we called it in the South, to help pay the light bill. And so utilities and food become essentials. And that's where the charities, we work in the space between those checks. That's as to income. But the other place where we actually do carry the flag and do the work is in services. Because think about this, the government doesn't do family counseling, and the government doesn't do refugee resettlement. That's done by local agencies and local communities. And the government does it because those agencies, whether they be Catholic, Lutheran, secular, whatever, they know the community. They're trusted in the community. So when the government wants to deal with a new problem, people, let's say they're going to release, as it's going on in my state right now, they're going to release a number of people who've been held in prison for years and years and years because we finally began reducing prison sentences. Then you've got to deal with how do you help these people when they come out. And what the government does is it contracts with local agencies, including Catholic Charities, and purchases services from them. Now, the bishops had a real caveat for that, though. They wrote, in establishing partnerships with voluntary agencies, public sector authorities must not make requirements that weaken agency identities and integrity or undermine agency commitments to serve those in need. Where I've heard it here, and I heard it in the United States, is where government, because they give you money for certain services, doesn't want you to do advocacy. And yet we think advocacy is part of our call. Or in California, right around the turn of this century, the legislature decided to define religious employer for purposes of government programs, but also purposes of tax exemptions and purposes of allowing you to do certain things. Like we felt that Catholic Charities agencies could hire a Catholic to be the executive director, let's say, and maybe the parish social ministry coordinator. There's usually very few positions. But they passed the law in which they defined a religious employer as those who employed only people of their faith and served only people of their faith, thereby removing all the Catholic social service agencies and the Catholic hospitals from the definition of religious employer. The hospitals and the social service agencies sued the state and lost in the Supreme Court of California, and that case was appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and the court refused to hear the case. And so this goes on. You'll have a city somewhere where they don't want to hear the director saying something about how they're spending their money and how they're caring for people, et cetera. And so they'll try to limit your advocacy, or in this case, try to restrict the definition of what is a Catholic agency. And 10th, and I've alluded to this multiple times, the 10th thing is that we believe that our services to people in need should be accompanied by speaking out about people's needs. So when I testified on behalf of the Catholic Charities Network in Congress, I always started with, let's say with a housing bill, we provide such and so many housing units to people in need around the United States, and therefore we want to say this about housing needs, that the service we provide is actually the credibility for our advocacy. And it's advocacy that, credibility that nobody else has, because if you're just a think tank somewhere and you're saying we should do more about this or that, people say, well, what do you know about this? And so what the point is, the church, the Catholic Church, is everywhere. And we're in every community, et cetera. As one friend of mine says, we actually have more outlets than McDonald's, if you think about all the parishes and agencies, et cetera. And so we think that we have a responsibility to speak out. The Australian bishops in 2017, 2018 wrote a social justice statement that said everybody's business, developing an inclusive and sustainable economy. And so we have to be able to not just feed hungry people, but ask, why are people hungry in this country or in your country? And our bishops wrote this near the end of this letter that they wrote on charity. In his apostolic exhortation, the Church in America, this is a letter that the Pope wrote, this is John Paul, after visiting the United States. John Paul clearly presents the Christian responsibility to ensure that charity and justice result in individual actions and work for systemic change. We Christians must, and here they're quoting the Pope, reflect the attitude of Jesus who came to proclaim good news to the poor. Pope goes on, this constant dedication to the poor and disadvantaged emerges in the Church's social teaching, which ceaselessly invites the Christian community to a commitment to overcome every form of exploitation and oppression. And so that's been built in. The advocacy has been built in. The national agency in the United States that I headed started in 1910, and they said back in 1910, we want to do this, we want to promote quality service, we want to do such, and we want to be the attorney for the poor in the country, to speak out for the needs of poor and needy people. And so what I've tried to do in this is to say, and the article asked Anthony to copy that for people. We'll get at the major points. I've given you some other examples and things like that and brought some things up to date. But I think this is Catholic in the broader and best sense of the word. It's not Catholic in the narrow sense, for example, as the legislature in California was trying to make it. But for us to be Catholic is to be all of these things at once. And when I used to talk to agency directors, I would say this is your job, is to try to keep your agency, and the agency boards, to keep your agency broad in the sense of the definition of what it means to be Catholic. So thank you very much.
Father Fred, thank you so much. What a substantive and inspiring presentation. That gives me a lot to reflect on, certainly, and to consider and ponder. Thank you. And I'm sure lots of people out there have got things they're pondering as well about all of this. Does anyone have a question to kick off our Q&A?
Yes.
Can I just go back to that legislation in California? Not understood. Is it, are they restricting the employment of Catholic people in Catholic agencies, or is it?
No, they were saying you can only get the exemption. This had to do with the anti-discrimination law. You can only get the exemption to hire only Catholics or any position as a Catholic if you're defined as a Catholic agency, meaning that all your staff are Catholic and all the people you serve are Catholic. And we said, well, we're not going to do that. But then they said, well, then you can't discriminate in any way. It said you can't hire a Catholic for even one position, et cetera. And it also affected their ability to get to contract with the state and things like that. So it was healthcare as well as charities. And it was clearly targeted to the Catholic Church. Yeah.
Did it end up affecting their tax exemption?
It might have. I'm a little disconnected from it at this point in time. I don't think it would affect it in terms of the federal government, because that's not the definition that the federal government used. It would be a state question. Yes.
Some agencies in Australia, like I'm just thinking about that intersection with government part, which is a really interesting part. Some agencies in government have run services for government, which are publicly funded, but at the same time have to sign contracts that they couldn't speak out against government policy in that area. And in particular, unemployment services is a really tricky area where there were work for the dole programs introduced that they felt that they weren't very uncomfortable with, like penalising people that didn't meet certain requirements, etc. And they had that very tricky area of trying to meet the compliance requirements of grants and still meeting their mission. Have you had similar?
Well, that's the example I used when they said they tried to restrict our advocacy, is when they do that. And I tried to argue to directors when that was happening that you don't want that to happen, because you also want to be able to say, and this is very tough to say, you know, you've been funding us to do this work this way. It doesn't work. We need to change this program. You need to change this program. It's not as effective. Or you need to make it more effective in these ways, et cetera. But they don't want to hear it. That's why I also talked about the importance, and sometimes you have to, I'm a lawyer too, so there's some very complicated things you can do, like, can you set up, I was talking to directors about how important it is to get what I call free money. What do I mean by free money? I mean money that has no strings attached to it. Money you raise from the public, et cetera. That lets you do a couple of things. One, it lets you speak out, and it lets you serve people that are unpopular, that nobody else wants to serve. And in some ways you can do it by setting up a separate entity with the free money that's not the contracting agency with the state. But it doesn't always work, and it's hard. But you're right, that's what I was talking about, because it happens in the States, yeah.
What would you say, sorry, what would you say the cultural phenomenon is that sort of entices the vast majority of the population in certain Western nations to endeavour to not help the destitute and poor whatsoever? What would you say is the responsible for that phenomenon in today?
There's some cultural things, like when we used to talk in the Jesuit world about working for social and economic justice, and later the documents began having the word cultural in there, about cultural systems and structures. And at first I was resisting this, and then I realized, no, culture is very important. Like we have these cultural things, like in our country, anybody can pull themselves up by the bootstraps. So therefore, if somebody's poor, it's their fault. The surveys in the United States for years, when I used to really track them, would be split right down the middle. It would be like, one year, it would be 45% think it's the individual's fault, and the 55 think it's social structures and systems, and the next year it would be the other way. And most recently, though, I saw a survey that said increasingly more Americans now are recognizing the social impact and the social factors. Like 60% now were saying it's the problem of systems and structures, and only 40% were blaming the individual. So part of it was that you can pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. In fact, I think it was like in 1870, the head of the St. Vincent de Paul Society in the United States was at their international meeting in Paris, and he stood up and said, In 10 years, there will be no more poverty in America because anyone in America can make, well, you all have this wonderful phrase I've learned since I've been here, fair go, you know, that anyone in America can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And so there's that built in. And then they do see some people do it, but there's a lot of research going on about, I used to try to write this when I was at the Institute, about whether people move up in their economic class over the course of their lives. How many people who are in the bottom quintile, which is like the lowest fifth, the lowest 20%, actually get out of there. And while some people do, and those are in the United States, they call it rags to riches stories. There was an author named Horatio Alger who wrote these stories about people who were born in a slum and became a multi-billionaire, and, you know, et cetera. But the fact is that, in fact, most people don't get out of that lower 20%. And most people are up in the top, stay there. I mean, they might slide down one category, let's say from the top 20% into the top 40%. But so there's this attitude in the United States anyway, that anybody can say can make it because they see other people make it and because the culture talks about those kinds of things. So you're right. It's really, there are things in the culture that reinforce this. We have mythology in the United States, what we call manifest destiny, which was the mythology that we had the right to march from the Atlantic to the Pacific and eliminate the Native Americans along the way, et cetera, that this was our manifest destiny from God. You know, and that's the role of myths within cultures, et cetera. Some of which are very important and caring, et cetera, and some of which have devastating impact upon people. And would that be true here?
Yes, but I guess I was sort of saying amongst the majority of the population, at least in my personal experience, a lot of them just do not help the less fortunate Apple period. Yeah. So there's like but yeah, you are right. Yeah, there is a like sort of an idea that that sometimes you blame the poor for being in their position, as if it's like their fault.
The other factor, our former Superior General, very famous man, Pedro Arrupe, in the 60s talked about we're becoming not Homo sapiens, you know, thinking man, but Homo consumens. That we're defining ourselves by what we consume and how much we have. And that then affects it, because then somebody doesn't have anything, they're nothing. Ignatius in the spiritual exercise, now let's get down a little deeper, it said, we'll talk about the temptation in the lives of good people is from what he calls riches to honors to pride. Now riches in this term is not just money, but it's anything that makes people think you're valuable, because it goes riches, and it was translated by somebody later on as saying, this is mine. So it's whether it's property or wealth or speaking ability or your teaching ability or your parenting skills. This is mine. Look at me, how good a executive I am, a boss I am, a witch person I am. And then the phrase that the scriptures use, only for God, I am. That we begin making ourselves gods because of what we have. And that there's a tension, he argues that there's a hook in every gift. And if we hold on too tightly to it, it hooks us. But it's in the culture. I mean, we have to pay attention to culture. And now I'm actually beginning to think, I was doing an interview the other day in Sydney, that there are technological systems, that we haven't written about these, but that and you will understand this, there are technological systems that shape us now. The professors at Loyola University in New Orleans were saying to me, there's students who can't read long, dense paragraphs anymore because they're used to reading 140 characters. And because we have the internet, which is great benefit, I got my last book done by almost entirely going back into the internet for stuff, but because we have that quick access to information, then we think problems are immediately solvable. It's just a question of finding that one quick answer. And so those things are shaping us as well as our technological systems and structures are shaping us too. And there's a lot of writing about people being very isolated because of the internet, et cetera, from one another. Anyway, so I think the church has to pay more attention now. We used to write about political and social problems, and then we started writing about political, social, cultural, religious. I think churches and church institutions can also have negative impact, et cetera. And so we have to pay attention to all of those things that shape us as human beings and our ability to love other people.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Fred. Are there signs of, I guess one of the things working in social services in these areas, the needs are so great and it can become difficult for the workers in there looking at these needs all the time. It seems to be escalating and the improvements might not seem to be making a lot of difference. Is there anything you could say about the hope that comes from our faith, or even just the signs of hope you might be seeing around the place on a practical level, but also the hope that comes from faith?
Yeah. When I did the third book, which I did after I left Catholic Charities USA, like 8 years later, but I'd saved a lot of talks and things, but also I went online. They had a chapter on the spirituality of people who work among the poor. And what the national organization had done was during Lent and Advent for 2 years, they'd had people out in the field writing a reflection on the daily scriptures. So I went back to those and just downloaded them all and then tried to analyze them and pulled out these values, one of which is hope. That people, and you know, we're people who believe in death and resurrection, and so there's a little bit of that sense about hope and the importance of hope in what we do. The best hope stories are Jesus' parables about seeds and forest growing from it, etc. But the best single quote on hope, I keep it in my wallet now, just for these occasions. In 1987, the Czech poet Václav Havel came to the United States and gave a series of talks, one of which he gave in Philadelphia at what we call Liberty Hall, where the First Continental Congress met. And he gave this talk in which the last 3 paragraphs were these, short paragraphs, as you can tell. And this is the best thing on hope. Either we have hope within us or we don't. It is a dimension of the soul, and it's not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. Hope is not prognostication. It is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. Hope in this deep and powerful sense is not the same as joy that things are going well or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. Hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. It is this hope, above all, which gives us the strength to live and continually try new things, even in conditions that seem as hopeless as ours do here and now. He says this in 86 or 7, while communism is still dominating his country, and he had been an outspoken critic, et cetera, et cetera. And 3 years later, everything he'd fought for and worked for happened. The government collapsed, communism collapsed in Eastern Europe, et cetera. So I think it's the best single thing on hope, other than the parables of Jesus, et cetera, that I think. And I think that's what keeps people going. And they're small victories, you know, and the advocacy thing is actually the hardest thing to have hope in, because we used to say when you feed a hungry family, you can leave and go home at night feeling like you did something really good. When you write a letter to Congress, how do you know it has an impact? And when I used to lobby the Georgia General Assembly with a wonderful guy who later was a member of the General Assembly, but he said, with something passed that I was working on elderly issues, he said, thank everybody, because you don't know who actually made it happen at the end. So just thank everybody who told you they were going to do something about it, even if they didn't do anything, thank them. Because you just don't know what creates that level of change. It's a lot of people working at things, et cetera.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Father Fred. That was terrific. I think what struck me was especially that foundation that you mentioned towards the beginning, drawing on the works of John Paul II and Benedict, and I think that gives us a lot of confidence for our ministries and enriches the work we're doing with the needy, knowing it's all so well grounded in the scriptures and then in the tradition of the church over the centuries. So that really struck me. You mentioned at one point as well something about a brown paper bag lunch, I think, that you...
Brown bag lunch.
Look what I have for you.
You got brown.
Brown paper bag. But not lunch in there. There are a few goodies from Notre Dame.
Oh, great.
A coffee cup and... now, I know you drink coffee, but...
I'm a tea drinker, yeah, that's great.
And a notebook and
always great.
Yeah, pens.
Okay, thanks.
No worries. Thank you very much. Please.